Legends by H.D. Lowry. Read by Miss Worm. This is the story told of John Lanine, the man that lay dying as I went forth from my cottage one Sunday at evening to preach at Porth. This, the story I pondered as I came down the coombe towards the village, set upon taking the path that leads by the cliffs to that next coombe, in which the chapel stands. For I had seen but yesterday how for some the torture of hell begins with the deathbed, and what I had seen remained with me, active in my mind. Men talk still of that terrible winter that bound the fields with frost, and afterwards hid them for weeks with deep snow at the beginning of the century. For 6 weeks the frost never lifted, even on our Cornish coast, where we are wont to have roses in our garden at Christmas time. Then came a space of warm and rainless weather, so that by the end of February the wells were low as in the hottest summer, and the birds, albeit decimated by the frost, would have been building had there been leafage anywhere revealed to their active quest. But with the opening of March, after a windless night of terrible coldness, the wind rose, and the snow began to fall, to drive, rather, in a sharp, cutting powder out of the east. For 2 days it fell continuously. For 2 days that wild wind harried it, so that the drifts in some places were of incredible deepness, while whole fields elsewhere had scarce a trace of snow. The sheep were smothered where they had gathered for shelter under the lee of the hedges, for the wind, driving the snow across the fields, could carry it no further than the hedges, but beating against them, raised it eddying into the air, so that great drifts were formed where it fell, and was piled up in the Luth. 'Tis of the first night only I have to speak, when the wind swept the sea of its ships, and strewed all coasts with torn bodies of men. Upon that night a great vessel came ashore in the bay, and quickly went to pieces on the rocks. That story is horrible enough. Let me say, then, that no tradition lays the wreck to the account of the villagers. No ship could live in such a wind and sea as raged that night, and the Bonne Marie was lured to her destruction by no treacherous light. Soon after dawn, when the villagers had dug a way out of their snowed-up dwellings, news came to them of the wreck, and in an hour the cliffs and beach were thronged with treasure-seekers. But John Lanine had spent that night upon the cliffs, and in the morning was not of the crowd. He was a young man then, and a splendid sailor. He was strong and rudely handsome. He would have been sure of liking had he not also been morose and clubbish to a degree. He had gone down to the sea in hope of finding plunder. He saw the ship come in under the cliffs and break up quickly as the great waves ground her sides against the rocks. Then, in the first glimmering of dawn, he set himself to watch for what the sea might cast up. Little enough he found, but presently, as the sky paled, he marked a figure that lay helplessly on a small flat ledge on the seaward side of a steep and weed-grown rock. In a moment he had gained the rock and was looking down on the ledge, where lay a dead woman just beyond the reach of the waves. She was young and had been beautiful. She must have died of exposure after the sea at full tide had flung her up to that ledge of the rocks. Lanine descended carefully and raised the body in his arms, climbing desperately with his limp burden until he gained the summit of the rock. There he stood for a moment, looking down at the body. He held it by the wrist so that it partly trailed on the rock, partly hung loose from his grip. He looked around him, then let the woman fall again on the wet weed while he knelt to rifle her clothing. There was nothing of value in the pocket of her dress, but on her hand was a ring of shining precious stones. For a space he strove to shift this ring, but his fingers were stiff with cold, and he couldn't move it. Though he had small reverence in his haste for that fallen temple of God, the woman's body. Then he lost all patience. He raised the lax arm and put the finger into his mouth, clenching his teeth upon it passionately. By fair means or foul, he would have that ring. But the finger of the dead woman turned and twisted in his mouth, grinding of itself betwixt his teeth, and the whole body, rising once and falling, writhed horribly, as a snake writhes when you've trodden upon it. Lanine started backwards with a shriek of horror, drawing himself up at full height against the cliff as he thrust the dreadful body from him. For memory afterwards, he had sight of the woman's eyes that slowly opened, regarding him as the body writhed and slid over the wet weed back into the sea. Then, presently, he turned and struggled through the snowdrifts back to the village. Of the years that followed, report is more vague, if not less terrible. For John Lanine left the village soon after the wreck of the Bon Marais. For 50 years, God let him live. And when, after 30, he came back, none dared to ask how he had spent the interval. There was a wife came with him, a young girl that spoke to him tremulously in a foreign tongue. She was a child, almost, white and frail and delicately made, with dark eyes, for ever pleading piteously for a little tenderness in this hard life. He may have loved the child well enough, but from this very fact, perhaps, he was only a terror to her. She died soon, and was laid in the churchyard on the slope of the Coombe side. Then, before his time, did this man enter into the blackness of darkness reserved to him, assuredly for ever. By day he wandered over the wastelands with his gun. At night he drank sullenly in his own house, or broke with terrifying boisterous mirth upon the sedate crowd that assembled nightly until 10 o'clock at the lighthouse. Men knew his utter misery, yet saw in him no object for their pity. For 20 years a damned soul had lived among us in Trelawney, and now, as night settled down on the sea, he was to go forth alone to judgment. Of this man, then, were my thoughts as I passed through the village and made my way up the steep pathway that leads out onto the cliffs. On my right, as I neared the top of the ascent, the great white beach that even then brought the gentry by scores each summer to Trelawney stretched in a semicircle 3 miles long. All was vague and cold in the growing darkness, but not so vague but that I saw beyond a doubt a thing that had been wonderful without the horror that followed. There is no landing at Trelawney save for fishing boats that are beached at high water and drawn up onto the tract of blown sand at the head of the combe. Yet at the water's edge, in the very shadow of the cliff, a great ship lay at anchor, and with all sails set. There was not the smallest breeze that night, yet her sails were bellied out as if she moved steadily before a strong wind, and still she lay motionless at anchor. Great as my wonder was, I remembered my ignorance of the sea and trusted that my wonder did but result therefrom. Others, at any rate, would have observed the appearance, and I, if it were lawful cause for wonder, might tell my tale when I had come back to the village. I must hasten, then, for the service at Porth. I turned again towards the wastelands, and upon the instant was aware of a man's figure that moved towards me silently through the twilight. I know not what benumbing horror fell upon me, but at the sight I stood stone still and turned deadly cold. The man moved towards me, silently, slowly. Then as he passed, I standing shuddering aside, his eyes were raised to meet mine. The face I looked upon was the face of the man Lanine, and I knew it as I looked, for the face of a man that went forth hopeless to meet the penalty of 70 sinful years. His eyes were fixed upon me, mocking still, as on that last night when I had sought to show him God's mercy and forgiveness. And thus he passed down the pathway to the beach. I watched him, petrified, and saw his figure disappear as the sands turned grey in the twilight. At the sound of a step behind me, I turned to meet Dr. Williams, who came awe-stricken across the waste. I could not speak for a moment. The words stuck in my throat. At last I found a voice. "John Lanine," I gasped. "Is just dead," he answered solemnly. And through the mists I marked that ghostly ship moving with all sails set out into the darkness of the sea.